Hi, and welcome back. I'm talking to you today about Earth Day, specifically about the establishment of Earth Day. If you know anything about Earth Day, you might know the very first one took place April 22nd, 1970. And typically, when we talk about the first Earth Day, we talk about the two guys who were really most influential. You might know them. There was Gaylord Nelson. He was the Wisconsin senator and an environmentalist who really founded Earth Day. And Dennis Hayes. He was the organizer of the first Earth Day and went on to actually create Earth Day all around a number of different countries around the world. But there's a woman too. Here's an article, actually, I have an article about the very first Earth Day, and it starts out by saying, in 1962, Rachel Carson, a renowned biologist and nature writer, published Silent Spring. And here's another one. This is actually an interview with Dennis Hayes saying, where'd you get the idea for Earth Day? And he said, well, a bunch of issues basically all came to a head by the late 60s, starting in 1962 with Rachel Carson publishing Silent Spring. So is it true? Did a woman launch the movement that would lead to Earth Day? Did Rachel Carson, who actually died in 1964, she wasn't even alive in 1970, did she plant the seeds that would lead to the first Earth Day in 1970? So let's start with who was Rachel Carson. By the time Rachel Carson's Silent Spring came out in 1962, he'd already written 3 massive bestsellers about the sea, and the most famous of them was this one, Sea Around Us, which was published in 1951. Within a few months of its first publication, it was selling 4,000 copies daily. It was excerpted in The New Yorker and in Reader's Digest and received numerous awards, including the prestigious National Book Award. It was on the National Bestsellers list for 86 weeks. When Silent Spring came out, Rachel Carson was already America's certainly best known and most respected nature writer. But Silent Spring was a really different kind of a book. For one thing, it's a Jeremiah. It's a really scathing indictment of indiscriminate pesticide use in the United States. The primary argument of her book is that these pesticides, new chemical pesticides, were being used in irresponsible and even dangerous ways without sufficient regulation and without real regard for their impact on nature. The essential argument of Silent Spring is that as humankind poisons nature, nature in turn spread the poison to mankind. We're all being affected by what's going on. Well, this book just sent shockwaves through the agricultural industry. When Rachel Carson was asked about where'd she get the idea later, she said it was basically hearing from a friend of hers who owned a bird sanctuary who was seeing pesticides being sprayed and then coming across the bodies of dead birds. So let's talk about these chemical pesticides, especially the best known of them, which was DDT. DDT came into widespread use just after World War II, in large part because during the war, it had been incredibly powerful for the Navy. It was so efficient at killing mosquitoes. DDT saved thousands, maybe millions of lives by eliminating the instances of malaria, which is this dreadful disease caused by the bite of an infected mosquito. And DDT is incredibly effective. You could spray DDT on clothes and it would stay on, even if you wash those clothes. It was pretty inexpensive and it seemingly had no impact on humans. After the war, DDT came into widespread general public use. You might even remember communities began spraying lawns and parks with DDT to control mosquitoes. You might remember seeing the DDT trucks and they'd have this cloud of smoke behind them, and not smoke, but DDT, and kids would ride their bikes or skate or run through them. You could buy fly killers that were impregnated with DDT. You could get wallpaper and paint. It was just incredibly widespread in the 50s. And by 1951, malaria was considered virtually eliminated in the United States, largely thanks to DDT. The problem, as Rachel Carson saw it, was that there was very little concern about the problems of these chemicals. You can see it in this ad. This is an ad from Time magazine on June 30th of 1947. 80 million tons of DDT and other chemical pesticides like Yeldrin and heptachlor were used on U.S. farmlands in 1958. And very little concern about any pesticide danger. The country was so in control. We had so firmly tied technology to patriotism that even to be skeptical of these advances was to be a traitor. But there were signs that not everything was quite as rosy as it seemed. In 1959, and this was just before Thanksgiving of 1959, it was announced that cranberries had been contaminated by a weed killer known to cause thyroid cancer in laboratory rats. Cranberry growers suffered huge losses that year because people weren't having cranberries for their Thanksgiving and Christmas. Then in 1962, just as Silent Spring was appearing, reports hit the media about thousands of women in Europe and Canada who had been prescribed thalidomide to alleviate morning sickness and gave birth to children with appalling birth deformities. In the US, Frances Kelsey, a physician with the Federal Drug Administration, had pretty much single-handedly prevented the sale of thalidomide on the US market. That a single woman could stop a powerful drug that was being promoted by well-intentioned experts really primed the public for the message of Silent Spring. But of even greater concern at the time was the spread of radioactive substances from a spree of open-air tests that were going on. This is an A-bomb test in the Pacific Ocean in 1946. And Carson explicitly used the era's concerns, or probably should say panic, about radiation to rouse her readers. She drew a really explicit parallel. She said pesticides are like radiation in that they are invisible, unavoidable, and deadly. So the timing was really good. When Silent Spring appeared in 1962, the public was primed to hear and respond to these terrifying ideas that Carson was talking about. But I think there's another reason Silent Spring had such an impact. Carson was just an unusually talented writer. She had a masterful ability to talk about complex scientific ideas in very understandable, readable ways. And she often uses storytelling, very vivid imagery to convey these ideas. And she knew her target audience. Her target audience were general readers, often including lots of housewives who loved gardening, who loved nature, who belonged to garden clubs, who had family traditions of garden clubs and love of nature, who lived in homes with backyards and cared about their communities. She'll tell stories over and over, like there was a woman who remembered moving into a house in a suburb of Chicago, and she loved to see all the robins and jays and wrens that would come to her bird feeder. And then one day she realized her bird feeder was almost deserted. The birds were just gone. This was actually the origin of the book's title. What would it be like to experience a spring with no birds, a silent spring? She does this over and over, telling stories about the pesticide-related experiences of ordinary people who love nature. And she contrasts them with bureaucrats, government officials, and men of science and industry. So you get the sense of this grassroots community of ordinary citizens living in typical American suburbs. This is Carson's home in Maryland. They're the sources in her book. They're the ones who notice the bird feeders deserted and who find the dead squirrels and birds. And the underlying question she has for these readers is, what are you going to do about it? She was not at all afraid to pose the moral question. And she says something along the lines of, are we not all diminished if we permit these deaths to continue? In other words, what she's doing is putting ordinary people on the line and making it okay to question the experts and to demand changes. In fact, I think that, as much as anything, is why people say Silent Spring is one of those rare books that changed the course of history. And it did absolutely launch a firestorm of controversy that would change the nation. Now, saying that Silent Spring can be credited with launching the modern environmental movement is not to say she acted alone. A lot of other scientists shared her concern in the early 60s. And there were other environmental crises throughout the 60s that really galvanized public attention. Researchers proved in the mid-60s that ospreys and other large birds of prey were indeed rapidly disappearing. They found evidence of a link between the spraying of DDT to kill mosquitoes and thinning of eggshells of large birds. There was a growing concern in the 60s about ongoing pollution in the air, in the water, in what might be the most famous human-made disaster of the decade. The Cuyahoga River in Ohio caught fire in 1969. Do you remember this? Because of all of the hazardous waste that was being dumped in it. But still, it's really hard to understate the impact that Rachel Carson's book had on the flurry of environmental activism and the policy changes that started to happen over the 60s. Without her, I think it's hard to say whether the environmental movement would have happened the way it did. The first Earth Day in 1970 was an enormous success. It's estimated that up to 20 million people took part. And these were ordinary citizens, same kind of people Rachel Carson was writing to. The incredible success of that first Earth Day put huge pressure on politicians to act, and major legislation followed, including the Clean Air Act of 1970, the Clean Water Act of 1972. One of Rachel Carson's top priorities after the publication of Silent Spring had been to encourage the creation of environmental commission, and it happened in 1970. This is the swearing in of William Ruckelshaus as the first administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. The EPA was given authority to set tolerances of chemical residues, which is what led to the banning of DDT in 1972. I think we can credit Silent Spring and Rachel Carson with really stirring the pot that led to the environmental movement of the 60s, that led to Earth Day. And really, you can see it when you see how much Silent Spring is recognized today as one of the most influential books in American history. Random House made a list in 1999 of the 100 most influential best nonfiction books of the 20th century. Silent Spring landed at number 5. Discover magazine put Silent Spring on its list of the 25 greatest science books of all time. Silent Spring has been continuously in print since 1962. It is still selling at an estimated rate of about 20 million copies a year. Altogether, it has probably sold more than 2 million copies. But here's even further. I think Silent Spring is an influential book, not just for what it did for our understanding of chemical pesticides, not just for what it did to help launch the environmental movement and Earth Day. I think the greatest legacy of Silent Spring might be that it really launched a massive paradigm shift in how we think about humans' relationship with nature. One of the things that she argued was that there's a deep connection between what happens in the environment and what happens to all of life. She set up this kind of we're all in this together kind of a feeling. In other words, it's not possible for humans to be above nature controlling it. What happens to insects, what happens to the soil, it's going to have an impact on humans. That's a mindset that is deeply ingrained today, but it really wasn't in the post-war era of the 1940s. By linking environmental health and human health, Rachel Carson really changed the way we think about our place in the world. So I think when we celebrate Earth Day, we should celebrate Rachel Carson, and we should celebrate this remarkable book that changed history. So thanks.